Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we are back with another entry into the new player Pugging guide situation here, and we're going to be taking a look this time at the upper half of Tazavesh called Soleah's Gambit. This is a 3 boss 5-man, whereas the other one was a 5 boss 5-man. And if you've ever done these additions to Mythic Plus coming in the middle of an expansion, you will know that the second half of these dungeons are almost always a very boss focused dungeon. Today I'm joined by my good friend Cop. We're going to be taking a look at this. Cop's a little bit more inexperienced with dungeons. He's kind of learning these things, and he hasn't done a lot of Tazavesh in general. So go ahead and tell them about where you're at and where you're starting with Tazavesh, especially these last few bosses.
I've only really done one kind of attunement, and I think I helped out a guildie with an attunement, but it's been almost 5 months since I've done it, and the things that I remember are the things that stuck out when we had to do them in Mythic Zero, like the lines on the last boss, or getting the colors in the right place on the first boss. But other than that, I don't remember a whole heck of a lot.
Now this dungeon is unique because it's also only 3 bosses, so that should be 3 easy targets for Bloodlust or Heroism. And the thing about Trash that we're going to find out today is that, you know, it's very interesting. It's very linear as well, so we'll see how that plays out in terms of count. But this opening area is a very unique one in the fact that there is just an enormous amount of mobs here, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if they actually try to get you to spend a lot of time in this area. But immediately we're going to see some really big pulls, and this is going to be heaven for a lot of classes right now. But there are a couple mobs in these pulls that are a little bit more than just fodder, so let's talk about them now. Perhaps the most notable of the mobs is going to be this very large Coast Walker Goliath. It can actually be death gripped and it can't be stunned. So that's a very weird thing. I don't know if that's intended or what, but it's been like that since the whole time. And this mob is going to do a few things. The whole Tidal Stomp thing, Undertow, increases damage taken from Tidal Stomp. This mob is just kind of meant to make you really pay attention to it. Anything that you are pulling in this area with these mobs is going to be something that you're probably going to want to cleave off this guy, because the longer you fight this guy, the more damage his main mechanic is going to do there. He also does that boulder throw there, which is actually just a ability being thrown into target. Does a lot of damage to them, knocks them down, and also does damage to any enemy near that target as well. So if everybody's stacked up on top of that, these mobs can be incredibly dangerous. And of course, if you chain pull them in a way that you have multiple at the time, then they're going to continue to stack up this debuff on you. So what you're seeing on screen right now is perhaps the most important mechanic that happens in the area. Invigorating Fish Stick is being cast by the Muckbrine Fishmancer, and it is an incredibly dangerous mechanic because it is going to slow you down to no end if you are not ready for it. What it's going to do is it's going to put a totem on the ground that is not only going to heal the mobs, but make them take less damage as well. Damage healed every 3 seconds, and also damage taken reduced by 25%. So it's as simple as simply just killing the totem, but that's a lot harder to do than it seems, because with so many mobs and so many health bars, a lot of people are going to have a lot of trouble. Now for me, I think the solution I will look to implement is simply making an ID exception in Plater. The add-on I have on the screen right now with all the nameplates, it's called Plater, and it's an amazing add-on because you can do a lot of really cool custom stuff to it. And one of the things we'll do is changing the color of the nameplate so we know exactly where it is. It's easier to see in a crowd. So there's a variety of ways to actually do this, but the way I'm going to do it is I'm simply going to add it to one of the already existing lists on Plater here. The way it works is Plater finds a ID of a unit and changes the health bars visual based on that. So there's a lot of default options that you can mess around with. I can do this a little bit more customized as well if I choose, but I think this is a good solution for now. And what you're looking for is this ID here, okay? It is 179733. That is the NPC ID of the Invigorating Fish Stick totem itself. Now that's different because there's also a spell named that, so you got to be careful of that. If you do the spell ID instead, it will just show whenever the cast of the spell is happening. But you can just add that to any of these things that already work. I'm choosing the unit important Plater, and it'll create a pink bar instead of a normal health bar with a little bit of a animation on it, and then it'll be very obvious. So let's show that off right now. And there you can see the pink and glowing health bar Invigorating Fish Stick. So it's immediately much easier to identify in a large pack. I'm sure there's going to be other solutions to this. What do you think would be the best solution for you, Cop?
Probably a weak aura, like something that would like put a big old diamond on top of it or something like that, just so I can easily switch to it.
Yeah, my immediate concern with this mechanic is that there's going to be a lot of them out at a time, so anything that's marking them isn't really going to work long term because it's just going to continue to try to mark them. And obviously in a situation like this where we pull all this extra trash, it's still perfectly recoverable if we can simply just target them and kill them, but you definitely want to make sure whatever you're using to do that is going to be very obvious and makes it as easy as possible for you. I assume this area is going to be very much pull a ton, make sure you're dealing with the 1 or 2 mechanics you have to deal with at a time, and quickly get out. Like I said, typically this type of dungeon is very linear in that way. So I think more importantly, we'll be dealing with the potential count situation here. It's pretty clear that you have to choose which path you're taking here and avoid potentially aggroing extra stuff as well, which could absolutely upset the count. As you've just seen from some of this small footage here, we already have multiple packs running around and aggroing other stuff, and a lot of these mobs do flee when they're low health. So this is going to be a really tough part of the dungeon. If certain affixes like fortified and maybe even bolstering come into play here, you're really going to have to be very cautious. Things like slow D&D, hunter trap, binding shot, ring of peace, AoE stuns are going to be really important to make sure you can navigate this area successfully. So on Wowhead here, we have a list of all the mobs that actually have the fish invigoration spell, and I'm a little unsure what's actually going on here because it seems like some packs, even though these mobs exist, they won't all cast it. Like you'll have all 5 of these mobs in some packs and there'll only be 1 mob actually casting it. So I'm thinking there might be some kind of internal cooldown or some other event that's needed for this spell to be cast, but very often if you pull a single pack or even 2 packs, you're going to have multiple of those totems, so dealing with them accurately is really important. On top of that, you're going to see some other abilities like Cry of Murloc, and what this seems to be is it's like an enrage, and it seems to only be cast when the mobs are low health. So the lower you get the mobs, or perhaps the longer you're in combat, the more damage they're eventually going to do, and you can have multiple stacks of this as well. A 50% damage increase for any of these Murlocs is going to be really devastating at times. You're going to need to make sure you deal efficient damage to these and not necessarily burn them down and then stop. And another mechanic we've seen on these Murlocs as well, which you might have noticed, is the blue swirl on the ground volatile pufferfish caster throws. An empowered pufferfish which explodes and inflicts a lot of frost damage to anybody in it. It's just a little blue swirl, so nothing too special, simply move out of that. But I still think navigating this area is going to be one of the hardest things, and we've been testing ways to potentially navigate it. There's what looks to be a really good option by running far to the left here. You can technically go around here. The problem is if you're in the water for too long, you might get eaten by a shark, so you can't actually get all the way around without aggroing stuff. But as you see down here, this area is not actually in that same boat, so it's potentially, I think it might be possible to actually get all the way over here and see how far you can get before you actually die. If that's an option, then it might be something a lot more people are considering, and maybe you could even weave in an Invis potion here and there. So once you get in this hall, you're going to have these Stormforge Guardians. They're going to be very reminiscent of mobs from Halls of Valor in that they have 2 of the same mechanics. Charge Pulse, a giant blue AoE circle to move out of, and Crackle, a frontal line that you simply have to dodge. The problem is if you're going to choose to fight all 4 of them that are down here at the same time, it might be very difficult to dodge all the mechanics, but I think this is a pretty high risk, high reward play that you might end up having to choose to make, and especially if your group is already focused on the big AoE and combining multiple packs, this would be something that your group is already well equipped for. Big thing as a tank is just trying to keep them always facing the same direction, and especially if you have 4, you really want to try to probably eat 1 or 2 of these mechanics to make sure it's going in the same direction and you don't have these 4 lines spreading out all over the place. Once you made your way down here successfully, you're now in front of one of the most interesting bosses ever developed for 5-mans, and honestly it's probably going to be a true pug breaker. It doesn't really have a lot of mechanics that are dangerous, but it has something that kind of harkens back to a mechanic in Battle of the Zara lore. You might have seen mechanics like this before on High Tinker Mechatorque, basically mechanics that require multiple people to communicate with each other, and that usually isn't that hard of a thing to do if you're all in voice communication together, but hugging this key is going to be particularly difficult. The cleanest way I've seen it done though is by using world markers, so I would really recommend using an add-on that allows you to place world markers easier. Formerly known as Exorcist Raid Tools, now Method Raid Tools has a bar that you can put up on the screen that allows you to simply click them and then place them. There's things like macros and keybinds that you can do to do the same as well, but regardless, if you're playing the tank role, it's very likely that you're going to be the one designating where all of these objects are going, so you're going to have to find a creative solution that works for you that minimizes the potential difficulty of this mechanic and makes it as fast as possible. I had not heard about this weak ore until after I had finished recording this, but there's actually a really cool weak ore, and what it does is you click the option here, you go up to this console, you choose which color is in the top left, top right, bottom left, and bottom right. It's really smart, as you can see by the picture. As soon as you click the blue, the other blue ones go away, so you basically only have to click 3 times before it shows them all. Any configuration, and then if you messed up, you can press the reset button. Otherwise, you press the send button. Now, I haven't actually used this myself, and at first glance, it might look like something that all 4 or 5 people in the group need, but it doesn't actually work that way. Apparently, it just sends it to the chat, which will help everybody communicate faster. And that's really all you're doing here. It's just emulating communication that should be happening in a normal group that isn't there because you don't have a voice communication for these pugs. So this is a great weak ores. This is going to be in the description down below. If you guys have found any other solutions that you think are even better, please do comment below. But let's take a look at least the basic mechanics of the encounter, because besides that mechanic, it's still pretty complicated. There's still a few things going on here. So the boss does this purifying burst mechanic, which is just basic damage. You're going to have these lines come out and follow a player, and then he's going to summon adds and do that frontal there. So the big thing about these adds is they're going to try to buff the boss and prevent you from dealing good damage to the boss. So you need to try to stop that in some way. That can be stopped with any type of stun or interrupt, like a death grip. And then of course we need to interrupt the actual cast of Valorous Bolt, which do a lot of damage too. But here we see the mechanic we're talking about. So there's 4 orbs on the ground here. Somebody can go up to this console, and then the orbs are going to correspond to where they need to be placed in little areas over here. You'll see the orange orb is right here, and that needs to be taken over to this. All you have to do is run over to it and then click this security panel here and drop it in, and now we've successfully done it. But obviously you don't want one person doing this, so all 4 people need to do it rapidly, and every time you have to designate where you're going. But in case for some reason you do ever find yourself in this situation we're in right now, this can actually simply be survived as well. This eventually ends after 40 seconds or however, it might be like a minute. You can actually survive this mechanic too. And it'll just go away, and you don't actually have to do it, but it seems extremely unlikely that it'll ever be relevant in Mythic Plus. Another potentially complicating part of this fight is these lasers. They also put a puddle on the ground when they're out. And we were just talking about that. I think it's going to be really important that they're placed in the right spot so people don't have to run through them while they're doing the orbs and placing them in the consoles later in the fight. But whether or not that's hugely important, I'm not actually sure. It's just something that I was thinking about. You know, that puddle does a lot more damage than anything else in the fight if you're standing in it for an elongated period of time. While you're in these phase 2, if the adds are still alive, they're actually protecting the consoles, so you have to kill them before the orbs can be placed in them, which is another big problem too. Of course, you're normally going to have these adds dead. It's just really important that you balance your damage well, because if you don't, you're never really going to be able to get this phase done accurately. And if you take the wrong color to the wrong thing, you actually get stunned too. It doesn't do anything else, but it's obviously not what you want to have happen. And it just slows down the phase as well. So ultimately what you have here is a boss that has not too much danger on it if you are really well coordinated, and could be potentially a pug breaker. So whatever you have in terms of solutions is what you want to try to really focus on. Make sure you get through this fight as fast as possible, and just make sure you're interrupting those adds and stopping them from putting that damage reduction on the boss. There's a lot of mechanics that can be done, and especially if you're a Blood DK or something like that, you could interact a lot with them with Death Grip, Gore Fiends and stuff like that, and just stopping them from getting those cast and stopping them from making the boss take even less damage, because really the faster you kill that boss, the easier it gets. If you only have to do that console phase once instead of twice, that's going to add a lot of time to your potential dungeon. So this whole first area is really a test in that. Making sure those mobs don't run all around and aggro extra stuff, using your utility there very well, using the add-ons and macros you have available to kill the fish sticks so you can employ big pulls and get through the area, and then potentially using any type of utility or ingenuity you have on this fight to make it as simple as possible is really how you're going to survive this in a pug world. Just dedicating to using the utility and stuff is going to be so insanely important here. Now for the rest of the dungeon, we have a much more regular style dungeon. We do have a fair amount of trash left and some interesting bosses, but nothing too crazy. What you have here is a lot less optional trash now, a lot more normal type of mobs, a lot of interrupting and stuff like that, but a lot more potential to pull extra and just keeping them together. We have the tidal burst here, another big swirl on the ground that we're going to want to dodge and potentially interrupt, but other than that, it's best to really try to make up some time here. There's nothing really crazy like we had with the Murlocs, so you should be able to pull to your heart's content and just be as aggressive as possible. So there are a few mobs doing some interesting mechanics in this area. The burly deckhand is going to use the disruptive shout ability that you saw. It does a fair amount of physical damage to everyone in the area. And we also saw that super Saison, which is chugging an extremely potent brew, increasing the damage of the caster done by 100%. But typically they're just going to be your standard melee mob. We're just going to ignore most of what they're doing. The Hourglass Tide Sage are the ones doing that tidal burst we just saw, conjuring a watery explosion at a player's location, inflicting frost damage. So very similar to what we saw in the Murloc area, ironically. And the officers do this sword toss ability, which is something you've seen before, like a mechanic in Halls of Atonement. Caster flings several swords in front of themselves, inflicting physical damage to everyone in front of them. So you can simply just move out of that, and it shouldn't be any more dangerous than that. Good thing about dying here as well is they actually have it set up pretty well, unlike in the lower Tazavesh where you don't actually have to deal with any of those portals. There's just going to be a spatial rift here that's going to take you right back into Boral's Harbor, and then we can go back to the boss. I would say this boss is probably the easiest boss in the entire dungeon out of all 8, but this is on Mythic 0. On Mythic Plus, this is probably going to be an entirely different concept. This is one of those fights that it's actually really annoying the longer it goes. And usually when you're killing this in the difficulties that are available to us right now, you're seeing a lot of burns where you're just having no actual mechanics, and even if 1 or 2 mistakes happen, it doesn't really cause any issues. But I could easily see this boss on a high tyrannical key being one of the hardest bosses that you've ever done, because there's just so many things that you're having to move out of. The main premise of the fight seems to be dealing with the ads, and the ads constantly come out from the ship to the left here. They don't really do anything, so I'm not really sure exactly what happens if you don't deal with them well, but the way you're supposed to deal with them is by getting them hit by the boss's infinite breath mechanic, which is a pretty cool concept. The tank has to position them on the ads, and yet again, another extremely good fight to be a Blood DK, because you can actually grip those ads into the infinite breath and then potentially be killing them, bringing a lot of effective damage to the fight. As the fight progresses, she's going to use the ability Double Time, which is going to cause all of her mechanics to basically accelerate, and she's going to start doing a mechanic where there's fire and a hook coming from the ship, and players are going to get dragged towards the ship. You need to resist the ability to get dragged into the water, otherwise if you do, you'll get stunned and die. All the while, the tank is going to have to continue to position the boss in a way that he's not hitting the group, but also killing the ads. And like I said, this fight is very easy in terms of the mechanics if you could handle them quickly, but the more things that go wrong and the longer the fight goes, the more potential you'll have that people are going to get dragged around, and it's just going to turn into a complete mess. So this will probably be a really good fight to Bloodlust on, but will it be up? That's the question. I'd imagine the answer is probably no if you used it on the first boss, so this is going to be a tough thing to contend with. But you see, the infinite breath comes out, and then you actually have a few seconds to move out of the mechanic after it's picked its location. Otherwise, there's all these fire puddles on the ground. And then we can make a play like this where we gore fiends them into it. And if you get hit by it yourself, you actually get stunned and knocked back slightly. But I think sometimes as a tank, this is probably a pretty good option to do. Now we also have a tail whip for the DPS, so you need to make sure that your DPS are not getting hit by that, all the while dodging the fire. And then after a certain period of time, the boss is going to start doing its phase 2 set of mechanics, which seems to be time based, so the quicker you fight, the less time you might actually have in this phase. As you see now, we have the hook coming from the pirate ship there, trying to drag Cop over to it. He's going to have to dodge not getting pulled into the water, but also the fire as well. You see the brutes actually just target and fixate on one of the players that aren't the tank, so the players that aren't the tank also might have a role in actively killing these mobs. It's also interesting, I just saw the tail swipe actually hits the brutes as well, which is kind of funny. Yet another extremely easy fight to solo though, because when all the mobs just fixate on you, you can just bring them right to the breath and kill them every time. But it does look like the longer the fight goes, the more double times you're going to see, potentially making the fight even harder. So all in all, a very frustrating fight from the DPS point of view. Cop, how do you feel about that encounter?
I dislike it heavily, because what you have to do with aiming the breath, there's always puddles 360 degrees around the dragon. As a melee, it's almost impossible to have a good uptime. I hate it.
I could see probably one of the harder parts of the fight is that as I'm dragging the boss and rotating it, it's potentially hitting you with its tail as well. Did you get hit by the tail that much?
I think I got hit by the tail a couple of times there, and it's almost like, because there'll be a sudden move and all of a sudden, oh, well, I got hit by the tail. A lot of times I'll have to be on its hind flanks to be not in the fire and yet still in melee range. And it's really tough to not be in front too, because again, sometimes the only opening will be just a slight little bit right at the front or right at the back, and it could be very easily, if you lull yourself to sleep, you're gonna get murked.
I could see there being advanced strategies for this type of fight, like maybe even just trying to tank it over in one of these corners here and always trying to keep it there. I'm not really sure how realistic this is, but obviously Blood DK has multiple ways that they can prevent being dragged over across the room there. I think ultimately funneling the ads into the boss's breath is probably the least important mechanic, and it's really just about getting as much damage out of the gate. It's one of those fights that the more damage you could do up front to that boss, the easier the fight gets, because I do foresee a lot of deaths on that encounter, and it's just trying to get to that finish line as fast as possible. But all in all, if you can handle it well, it is certainly the easiest of these 3 fights, and it should be the one that's the most pug friendly. There's not really any mechanics that anybody in a high coordinated group will have to do that a pug won't be able to do. But now we are on to the final room of the dungeon, and this is again a lot of optional trash here, so you can really mix and match your count. And even though the Murloc area is very annoying and potentially slow, this area is much more dangerous. Drifting star is one of the mechanics you're going to see on these guys, and that's basically just a projectile that gets shot out, and if you get hit by that, you take a bunch of damage and get knocked back. And there's also this wandering pulsar, which is a bigger deal than it looks, because every time it casts that pulse ability, it does a large amount of magic damage to everyone. So you could potentially kill it, but I'm not really sure that's going to happen, and I assume this is going to be a huge pain to heal through. In that first pack, we only had 1 of those, but coming up here, we're actually going to have the opportunity to fight 2, so that's where it's going to get really complicated. So these mobs, while fewer in number, are very dense in terms of mechanical difficulty. You basically only have 2 mob types here, and that's the Devoted Accomplice or the Focused Ritualist. Both do very important mechanics that you're going to need to understand in order to kill this trash succinctly. The Accomplice is going to constantly do an ability called Energy Slash, which doesn't do that much damage on its own, but actually leaves a magic debuff that is dispellable that makes subsequent energy slashes do more and more damage. This is probably something, again, you could AMS, but realistically this is going to be on the healer to deal with. They're also going to cast an ability that heals them. It's going to heal, it's called Reinvigorate, but it's also going to grant the caster 50% haste for 10 seconds if it goes off. Now that haste buff is actually dispellable as well by a magic dispel like a shaman might have, but again, I would just recommend definitely interrupting that because it heals for a lot. And the ritualists are again going to be one of those types of mobs with a bait cast. That hyperlight bolt is going to effectively replace their melee, so it's not really something you need to deal with, and it might distract you from interrupting other key mechanics happening in these packs. The big mechanic you really need to interrupt is the Unstable Rift, which is a long 4-second cast, but if it gets off, it does a lot of arcane damage to everyone near the mob. And because we have this patrol here, it's probably pretty easy to accidentally aggro extras, so definitely want to try to pull these back and maybe get a couple interrupts on those hyperlight bolts to make that happen. After that, the priority is not necessarily any of the mobs specifically, but it's just handling the mechanics properly, making sure the healer is dispelling, and making sure the key interrupts are happening. The patrol on its own is pretty dangerous though. 5 mobs, a lot of danger that could be present, so you need to make sure that you're not pulling this with another pack, and you need to be ready to make sure the interrupts are happening. Probably the biggest issue might actually be the heal. If you let multiple of these mobs heal, this is going to be a very long and dangerous pack. So now we have the 2 Star Seers, which are the mobs we started the room with. 2 Wandering Pulsars are going to be out. A couple Drifting Stars might hit some players as well. If only the tank gets hit by, it's not too dangerous, but as you can see, this mechanic is really going to eat up a lot of damage. Looks like you can actually just avoid one maybe as well. They do kind of drift around the room, so it's probably possible to just stay away from that other one. Strange enough is the fact that this portal doesn't actually work. So if you die at this point in the dungeon, you're going to spawn back at the Murloc area, and then the portal, the rift there we showed earlier, that's just going to take you back to Borealis. So that doesn't actually take you here at any point. This could be bugged though, because I imagine that you are meant to be able to travel through this dungeon a little bit easier. I'd imagine a few deaths on the way here, so something to keep in mind. And now we are on to the final boss, an incredibly long and mechanically dense encounter. We're going to be fighting this boss. The health pool is going to be very deceiving because around 0.5% she's going to heal and switch into a phase 2, which is going to be completely different than phase 1. Phase 1, the main focus is going to be on the additional targets she spawns. They're going to be assassins that are going to constantly try to jump away and cast an incredibly dangerous spell. So yet again, Blood Decay, incredibly powerful on this fight. Gripping them, stunning them, gorfing them, range interrupt, all of these things you're going to want to do a lot of. You could potentially stun them before they blink. You could potentially grip them back to interrupt the cast. Otherwise, that's going to be on your DPS to make sure you're handling them and killing them as fast as possible. They do die really fast, but they can overwhelm you if you're not focusing on killing them, which is probably what you're going to end up doing. You're going to really want to put a lot of damage into this boss to really shorten this fight, because this can be a very long encounter, especially if you have 1 or 2 people die along the way. The other main mechanic you're going to see throughout the entire fight is Collapsing Star. Soleah forms an orb containing 4 charges of collapsing energy that persists for 25 seconds. Somebody has to soak that and get that off, but every time you do, it's actually going to put a dot on every player and do a bunch of upfront damage. So ideally what you'll do is have probably the tank or perhaps your most bulky or most range-oriented player, run into that and soak it every few seconds, whenever seems most adequate, but not putting the healer in a position of stress. Then if for some reason you decide you don't want to soak all 4, you can simply let the last charge expire as well, but regardless, once it expires, any charges that are still there get applied as a dot. You could potentially try to just do that too and just never soak one and just try to heal through it, but I can't imagine that's going to work. Even on this low difficulty, it's still doing an immense amount of damage. So let's take a look at the phase 1 mechanics. Here's the summon assassins. You're seeing 2 mechanics, 2 assassins coming out here. Ideally, we'll keep them together and quickly AoE them down, but again, it's going to be a balancing act on whether we want to put big damage into them or simply just let them exist and continue to kill the boss. There's the collapsing star. We're going to try to soak the first stack immediately, get that ticking off so we don't have any stress on how long it takes, because you do only have 25 seconds to do all 4 stacks, and it does knock you back when you get hit too, so kind of a pain. And Cop's going to take a stack there as well. I don't think it matters who takes the stack, but obviously as Blood DK I can AMS the stack, so it's a pretty good idea to just go ahead and AMS and run into that, potentially getting the stack only on me. But as long as you're in phase 1, you're also fighting assassins. And there's a shuriken blitz there, so we see that casket off. It's just going to do a ton of damage, put a dot on you as well. Physical damage over a long period of time, every 1 second dealing damage. Probably not a wipe if you let that cast go off, but definitely something that's going to really put the healer in a bad position. Also going to do that hyper light spark or something like that, just a basic healing check, make sure the healer's on their toes. Yet another mechanic the healer's going to have to do. There's really a lot of healing on this fight. Probably going to be one of the most healing intensive fights. So we have a boss at 30% here, looking like we're doing really well. 500k health, and here we go. I wonder what happens if you actually were able to kill her at this point. Either way, not possible. Going back to 1.27 million, so boss is back in full range here. So here we are in the second phase. And this phase is interesting because you might have done this on hard mode, and you might have noticed that these stars are really important to deal with. But basically how it works is 2 people get linked, and you need to shoot these arrows through the stars. So the quicker you do this, the better, because every time you hit one of these, you're getting a stacking debuff from this mechanic. So if you fail a couple times there, it's going to get really hectic and really high damage over the course of the fight. But that's not the only thing you're going to see. You're going to see her shoot out these enemy fragments that are energy fragments that are going to go ahead and electrify these stars. And then you'll simply have to position yourself in a way that you're dodging all of these. This can be extremely easy if you get lucky, but as she moves them around later in the fight, it can actually get pretty complicated. All the while, you'll still have the collapsing star going out, so you're going to have to deal with that and potentially deal with this hyperlight nova, which is simply just move away from where those stars are. But it's a very long encounter, and I'd imagine a very healing intense encounter no matter how well you deal with it. Potentially making the wrong decision at any given time, like maybe accidentally getting 2 stacks of this hitting, or a couple people failing to dodge these energy fragments could be really dangerous and potentially put your healer in a situation where they simply can't recover from it. Getting hit by that also leaves a dot on you as well, which I didn't even realize, so that makes it even harder. But she's going to periodically do this mechanic again, and now because these things are spread out, it's going to be a lot harder to potentially do. Like I was saying though, on hard mode you had to get all of these at once, which does make this a lot easier. You don't have to do that on Mythic Plus luckily, but you just need to do it quick enough that people don't get too many stacks and potentially die to that mechanic. But you're basically fighting the health pool of a normal boss twice, so this is going to be a really long encounter, and I can see this on Tyrannical causing a lot of problems for groups. Really, the bosses in general in here are probably the hardest 3 bosses in any dungeon set. So now you've seen that entire dungeon comp as a DPS. How does it make you feel?
It's wow. It's a very intense dungeon because there's so much movement. I can see it being something that is very frustrating for a DPS player. Ranged probably that don't have the ability to move and do damage are going to have a lot of trouble, on especially this last boss. You can see a couple of them are really bad for melee. So yeah, this is going to be a headache for DPS, especially if you're pugging.
I think it's also a really bad dungeon for being inexperienced, because it feels to me like, you know, if you do a dungeon like Plaguefall, a lot of the bosses just don't really have any mechanics that you actually have to worry about as a DPS. You know, maybe there's one boss in each dungeon that you really do need to know. So with your experience, like, how do you feel about that compared to this set of 3 bosses? Do you feel like there's any boss you can just sleep on, or how do they compare to other dungeons you've done?
I don't think there's a boss you can sleep on in this dungeon. I mean, I can just tunnel on a lot of bosses, like say Theater of Pain. I can just DPS on a lot of bosses. But here, no. I have to be 100% aware of what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, what mitigations I have, how to not stress the healer, how to not take damage, because there's so much going out. There's just a lot that I have to be perfectly focused on to survive properly. I think this is the toughest of any of the Mythic Pluses coming up for the season, especially the way the affix works, because it seems There's so many of them.
Reflecting on previous seasons' difficulties with these new dungeons getting added is an interesting task because in Legion, the Karazhan equivalent was actually pretty straightforward on weeks where you had no tyrannical affix. Now, of course, in Legion, tyrannical was much, much, much harder than it has been in the recent expansions, and it was almost like a free dungeon. So that kind of translated the same way in BFA too, where the final set of the 2 dungeons was actually much easier on fortified than it was on tyrannical, but those bosses were still really difficult mechanically. Now, this dungeon though, since it only has 3 bosses and the trash is so wide at sometimes, it does make me think it's going to be a lot more balanced. Makes me think with a 3 boss dungeon, you will probably have pretty equitable difficulty between the 2 sets of affixes, but I just can't help shake the feeling that these 3 bosses are just going to farm people. Like, it feels like they're the most mechanically complicated bosses in the game, and they're all in one dungeon. How do you feel about that?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I would much rather do what's probably going to be called lower Tazavesh than upper. You know what I mean? Like, I would much rather do 5 bosses in the market than these 3. Because I just know if I'm pugging 100%, somebody in the group isn't going to know what they're doing, and it's going to break pugs or take 2 hours to do a dungeon or what have you. But it's going to be harder than any of the other ones, just from what I can see.
Yeah, I think maybe the big wild card is actually going to be the timer, because it was a pretty short timer, but it's a pretty short dungeon. So it just makes me wonder exactly what trash is going to look like, what a route is going to look like. There's really not a lot of options, you know what I mean? So it depends on how well you can actually combine trash. If you can pull like quickly and through that first area and not have a lot of mistakes and not get way too much count there, it's going to be really beneficial. Like, if you fly through that first area and you don't have any issues with the bosses on a fortified week, this might be one of the easiest dungeons. And that's kind of what happened with Workshop in BFA. It was like, if you could make no mistakes on the trash and you had an easy fortified week, nothing crazy, then it was like a very, very, very easy key. That and Junkyard became one of the easiest dungeons in the game, depending on the affixes. So we'll see, but I totally agree with you. I think actually doing the Streets of Wonder, the bottom side is actually called, great name. That is actually probably a much easier dungeon to do, just because it's a lot more normal. There's no really strange fights, and even though there's a lot of trash, a lot of travel, and potentially a lot of time spent out of combat, I still think it's a much more puggable dungeon, a dungeon that's much more friendly to somebody who's inexperienced as well. So any closing thoughts on these dungeons, Cop?
The one thing that strikes me as we're talking about that, and that is, if we, with every other dungeon, if you don't make count by the time you're done, you have some way to go back. I don't see, and I mean, maybe that is a bug, as we said, with that portal, but if you don't get count, what the hell are you supposed to do at this point?
Oh yeah,
you know what I mean?
You're saying you literally can't leave the dungeon at this point, huh?
Yeah, like there's no way out right now for us to go, other than hearthing. So like,
that's an interesting problem.
How would we go back to get count? If we had 99.9% count, how do we do it? That's my question, right?
That's a good question. It's probably a bug. I'm not going to lie about it. But I think realistically, we have seen something somewhat similar in the past. I remember especially in the Underrot, it was a real pain if you went down to that last boss and you didn't have count. It'd be really difficult to get back. But typically, there'll probably be an NPC that can take us back. The question is, how much time you would be losing doing it, because obviously the problem with the route in general is just like, you really have a lot of trouble controlling what you pull in that first area.
Yes.
I think it's more likely that you'll be way over count than way under, but yeah, still a very valid complaint, especially, I don't know, if people are going to try to maybe shroud those opening packs. We did have the option to skip a lot of it because we had the relics there, the seasonal affix in that first pack that you jumped down to of the Murloc, so you could actually just take the shroud one there and just probably skip maybe even all the way to the Goliath area, to the second area where the first boss is. So it's very interesting. I mean, I'm not really sure what people are going to do routing wise here, especially with that first area being so freeform. But all right, thanks for watching, guys. Make sure if you have any questions, you leave a comment down below. I'm very dedicated to making sure that everybody gets as much information on these dungeons as possible, so they aren't completely dead keys in those opening weeks. I do think these will probably be the hardest dungeons they've ever added, and this is really going to flip a lot of people's keys over. So really get that info now, guys. Really learn as much as you can, especially as a tank. It could be a really big place. So thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.